as y'all know, the missions conference is coming up in a couple of weeks, and of course, every year before the mission conference starts up, Pastor asks us to speak on missions giving. Usually he gives us a lesson to follow. This year he just emailed the teachers and said, please make sure you hit on missions giving. And so that's the one thing, that's one of the topics, and then the other topic is to get right back into where we're at in our study of the end times and of Revelation. But as far as missions goes, and I know, again, I'm speaking to the choir in this class. I mean, I don't know. Y'all don't tell me. I don't tell y'all. So y'all don't tell me whether or not you give or how much you give. And I don't want to know. That's between you and God. And I don't tell y'all either. But giving to missions is, again, a very important thing. I told you before, but I'll remind you. I grew up on faith promise. And I don't mean I grew up learning about faith promise, which I did. I mean, that's how my family was supported. My parents were missionaries down to the border of Texas and Mexico. Back when you had the annual crossing of the migrant workers from Mexico to go and work up in the fields, and they would start in South Texas and work their way. They'd work their way all across the country. You know, they'd be up in Idaho doing potatoes, stuff like that. And that was the focus of my parents' mission work, was on those people. Okay, so my mom and dad did not have traditional jobs. We relied on the support of churches, who most of whom relied on faith promise from their people to be able to support missionaries. So I am very much in favor, obviously. You could say I'm even biased a little bit, because that's how I grew up. And I grew up very poor because of it, but I did not miss out on anything. So I'm not saying that to complain. I'm saying I did not miss out on anything. You know, by growing up poor, you get to actually see a lot of blessings that a lot of people don't get to see. So, I mean, because my family started a camp, a summer camp for kids. Churches put in money. Our group of youth came down from a church in Ohio. We had a guy who lived in, I think it was Arkansas, whose business was building swimming pools. I got to have a swimming pool growing up. Even though I was poor, I got to have a swimming pool growing up. Before that swimming pool came in, we used to swim in the canal with the snakes and the frogs and everything else. Okay, but then I got to go swim in a swimming pool. And it didn't cost us a dime, because people did that. But I mean, the swimming pool wasn't for us. The swimming pool was for the camp. And we had camp buildings built up, you know, bunkhouses and things like that. And so growing up, I had plenty of different forts to play in. So I might have been poor, but I didn't miss out. That's what I'm saying. And I got blessings that, you know, most people don't even really think about, you know. And it might not sound like much, but trust me, it's a lot, okay? So I just want to remind you, I mean, you come up into this class to listen to me teach, and honestly, without the faith promise thing, could I say I'd be up here teaching? And the answer, probably not. Probably not. So I just want to greatly encourage you as we approach this time of making your faith promise pledge. But I also want to, because there's one verse, and I've done this before in the past, but I want to make sure. So if you turn to 2 Corinthians 8, excuse me, it is the fall allergy season. a verse that's always used as far as faith promise goes. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 2 Corinthians 8 says, "Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministry of the saints." Now, honestly, this is usually used to show that they gave beyond their ability. I do want to, make sure, because I have seen this happen to people. They believe God's told them to pledge more than what they can. And then they do it, and then they cannot fulfill their pledge. Because a lot of times, there's a lot of emotion that actually gets played into this. I just gave y'all an emotional story, right? And I'm not doing it to try and get y'all to raise more money or anything like that. I'm just letting you know the facts and why I actually believe in faith promise. But I want you to be careful, because what does it say before it says that they gave beyond their ability? Right before they gave beyond their ability, what does it say? That I bear witness, verse 3, "For I bear witness that according to their ability," and then beyond their ability. So what is Paul saying here? Paul's saying they gave out of what they had, and then whenever they got a little extra, they gave extra. Paul is not saying that they made a pledge that they were going to give more than, listen, if you're making $2,000 or $3,000 a month and you think God's telling you to pledge $1,000 a month, is that really something that you have the ability to do? And I'm not trying to deny the power of God to give you that, but what I'm saying is, is that something God's telling you to do, or is that your emotion talking to you and telling you to do it? And you need $2,500 or $2,600 a month to live, and you only make $3,000. Is God really telling you to pledge another $1,000 on top of that? Do you see what I'm saying? You got to be careful. You got to be careful. Don't give based on emotion, because, and here's the part that's never talked about in faith promise. Go on to verse 5. "And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord, and then to us by the will of God." They first gave themselves to the Lord. How many of you have ever heard that in a faith promise teaching? I've never heard it. Okay? And if you give... Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
But that's the only way you can really hear from God, is if you give yourself.
And that's my point. That's my point. See, if you're gonna get all emotional about this and say, oh yes, I know I only make $3,000 a month, and I know I need $2,500 to live on, but I just know God's telling me to pledge $1,000 a month. Now, is that you're emotional, or is that God talking to you? You hit the nail on the head. You have to give yourself to God first. You can't be just a Sunday Christian or something like that and make a faith promise pledge. Remember, if you're making a pledge to the Lord, He actually does expect you to keep it. Okay? So, that's my point, is make sure that you're giving yourself to the Lord before you're making a pledge. We've got 2 weeks of faith promise teaching today, next Sunday. Next Sunday, we'll all be down in the main auditorium. Okay? There's no class up here. And then the next Sunday after that is the faith promise. No,
Next Sunday.
It's a conference.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Oh, I'm wrong on that. Okay. So my bad. So you got this Sunday, the next Sunday is a conference, right?
Yeah.
And then usually they go 1 to 2 weeks after the conference before they say, you know, we need your pledges in. All right. So my point is, don't make your pledge today. Don't make your pledge next Sunday. They're asking for, you know, they're giving you 3 to 4 weeks. That's the time to make sure that you're actually giving yourself to the Lord so that you can hear what He is actually telling you to give. So that if you're making $3,000 a month and spending $2,500 just to live, and God says, all I want you to do is give 100. And every once in a while, I'm going to kick a little extra your way, and you give that too, which is exactly what we see here. Again, in verse 3. In verse 3, for I bear witness that according to their ability, and yes, and beyond their ability. They gave what they had, and then when they could, they gave more. Okay? They didn't do faith promise back then. Faith promise is a fairly new thing. Happened in the 20th century, the 1900s. So, just something to remember. Make sure that you spend your time, you're giving yourself to the Lord so that you know what He is going to have you give. Okay? And you know what? I mean, if you've been given the same amount for the last 15 years because that's all you have, that's fine. That's fine. It's between you and God. But don't overpromise out of emotion. And it's emotional to think, well, I've only been given, $50 a week for the last 15 years, so I should give more. No, that's emotion talking. That's not God talking. God's not going to say, you should give more. What's God going to say? I want you to give $55. You know what I'm saying? God's going to give you a real clear thing. He's not going to say, hey, Francine, you should give more. He's not going to say that. He's going to say, Susan, you've been doing 50. I want you to do 55 now. If that's God really talking, that's how God's going to talk to us. Okay? So keep that in mind. All right? As we get ready for this faith. All right. So now let's get back into looking at the Old Testament to help us figure out Revelation. Okay? And a couple of weeks ago, and I still have a copy of the old lesson, we compared Daniel and John. Okay? Everybody, you got that lesson, right? Yeah. So we compared Daniel and John. And I threw in another name that we didn't compare, but I actually want to look at that other name. Do y'all remember who else I said we could compare? Who else had similar visions? An Old Testament prophet? No, but Ezekiel. Okay? And so what I want you to do is I want you to turn to Ezekiel chapter 1. And I'll do this first. While y'all are turning there, I'll just give you a reminder. When we were comparing Daniel and John, remember in Daniel chapter 7, all of a sudden in verse 9, because in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel's getting his vision of the 4 beasts. And then all of a sudden that vision is kind of interrupted. And it says, I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued, and it came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were open. And then it goes back into the vision of the 4 beasts. Okay? And remember, this is actually when I mentioned Ezekiel, is because it says about his throne was a fiery flame, and its wheels were a burning fire. And that's when I mentioned Daniel. But you remember, I said, oh, what you're actually seeing here is the throne room of God, exactly what John saw in Revelation chapter 4. After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven, and the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you things which must take place after this. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne, and he who sat there was like a jasper and a sardius stone in appearance. And there was a rainbow around the throne in appearance like an emerald, and around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their head. Okay, do y'all remember? We made that comparison. Okay. And again, going back to Daniel, it opens up with, I watched till thrones were put in place. Those are the thrones of those 24 elders. All right, let's go back now. You're in Ezekiel, and let's start in Ezekiel. And I'm not going to read the first 3 verses. I'll let y'all read that one. But he's in Babylon. He's part of the Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel was from the tribe of Levi. Ezekiel was a priest. He was a priest and a prophet. Okay? And he says, Then I looked, and behold, a whirlwind was coming out of the north, a great cloud with raging fire engulfing itself, and brightness was all around it, and radiating out of its midst like the color of amber out of the midst of the fire. Also from within it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. And Ezekiel's going to go into the most descriptive telling of these living creatures. Remember, John saw them in Revelation around the throne, right, guarding the throne. Ezekiel's going to go into their appearance very, very much into it. But I'm going to skip to verse 15 because I want you to see this. I looked at the living creatures. Behold, a wheel was on the earth beside each living creature with its 4 faces. The appearance of the wheels and their workings was like the color of beryl, and all 4 had the same likeness. The appearance of their working was, as it were, a wheel in the middle of a wheel. And when they moved, they went toward any one of the 4 directions. They did not turn aside when they went. As for their rims, they were so high they were awesome, and their rims were full of eyes all around, and 4 of them. So there's 4 of these wheels, 1 for each of the guardian angels that's going around the throne too. When the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. And when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, because there the Spirit went. And the wheels were lifted together with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When those went, these went. When those stood, these stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up together with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Okay? What's going on here is you're having, remember, when we talk about Daniel and John, I said, Daniel's seeing the throne room of God, but he's seeing it in a portable way. So is Ezekiel. Okay? So is Ezekiel. But if we continue on, let's see where I'm at here. Verse 26. And above the firmament over their heads was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like a sapphire stone. On the likeness of the throne was a likeness with the appearance of a man high above it. Also from the appearance of his waist and upward I saw, as it were, the color of amber, with the appearance of fire all around within it. And from the appearance of his waist and downward I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire with brightness all around. Like the appearance of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the brightness all around it. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Who is he seeing here? He's seeing the same one that Daniel saw, the same one that John saw, seated on the throne. Who was that?
God the Father.
God the Father. God the Father. He's seeing God the Father. Now, and it's very interesting here because like in Daniel, well, John gets a vision, but initially, who does John see initially? In Revelation chapter 1, who does he see? Jesus Christ, right? And then Jesus has angels show him things. Okay? Daniel, who does Daniel see? Well, he sees some particular angels, but he also sees Jesus Christ. Remember, we talked about that. We made that comparison, how they were dressed exactly alike. Okay? But Daniel also sees one on the throne. John saw one on the throne. Here we have Ezekiel seeing one on the throne. Who's on the throne? God the Father. Okay? What does Jesus say? Where does Jesus say his point of glory will be? At the right hand of my Father. Okay? So, who is Ezekiel seeing here? He's seeing God the Father. Now, there's a slight difference between Ezekiel and the other two because guess what? Ezekiel gets his vision and gets talked to directly by God the Father. And you'll see that in verse 2. So when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard a voice of one speaking. And he goes on from there. And if you keep on reading, okay, guess what else Ezekiel's going to see? The same thing that Daniel saw, the same thing that John saw, a scroll. A scroll. And he said to me, Son of man, stand on your feet, and I will speak to you. Then the Spirit entered me when he spoke to me and set me on my feet. Notice he had to have help getting on his feet. Ezekiel also fell down like he was dead. And I heard him who spoke to me, and he said to me, Son of man, I am sending you to the children of Israel, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me to this very day. For they are impudent and stubborn children. I am sending you to them, and you shall say to them, Thus says the Lord God. As for them, whether they hear or whether they refuse, for they are a rebellious house, yet they will know that a prophet has been among them. And you, son of man, do not be afraid of them, nor be afraid of their words. Though briars and thorns are with you, and you dwell among the scorpions, do not be afraid of their words, or dismayed by their looks. Though they are a rebellious house, you shall speak my words to them, whether they hear or whether they refuse, for they are rebellious. But you, son of man, hear what I say to you. Do not be rebellious like that rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. Now when I looked, there was a hand stretched out to me, and behold, a scroll of a book was in it. Then he spread it before me, and there was writing on the inside and on the outside, and written on it were lamentations and mourning and woe. Let me ask you this. What was that scroll that John saw with the 7 seals? What was that filled with? Lamentations and woes, right? I mean, you look, starting with the 7 seals. What are the 7 seals? Are they good things or are they bad things?
Bad things.
They're bad things. And at the end of the 7 seals, you have 7 trumpets. Are they good things or bad things? They're bad things. And then at the end of the 7 trumpets, you have 7 vials. And are these vials good things? No, they're bad things. And there's even a point in Revelation where it says, you've only had a few woes. There's 3 more woes to come. And they're going to be, and it even says, woe to the men of the earth when these woes come. Okay? So, lamentations and mourning and woe. Guess what? Ezekiel is seeing the exact same scroll that Daniel saw and that John saw. There's a difference between Ezekiel and Daniel and John. And then there's a difference between John and Ezekiel and Daniel. The difference between Ezekiel and Daniel and John is God the Father told Ezekiel, I am sending you with this vision, this prophecy, to whom? Who is this for? Who's this?
Children of Israel.
The children of Israel. Ezekiel, this prophecy is specifically for the children of Israel. Okay? Which does not mean that we cannot learn from it, but that was specifically who Ezekiel was speaking to. That's who he was sent to. Daniel and John, who were their prophecies specifically sent to? Anybody know? Anybody want to take a guess?
Lost.
All the saints. All the saints. And when you read Daniel, like when Daniel talks about the tribulation that's to come, he talks about how the saints are suffering. Not how Israel's suffering, how the saints are suffering. What does John talk about too? How the saints are suffering. And by the way, did you notice that in Daniel was actually told to seal up the book? And then John gets to see the book unsealed? Because that was sealed up for that whole time. Okay? And then later on it was to be unsealed. Remember, God told Daniel, seal up the book, for it's for the time of the end. Okay. Even Daniel's visions, one of the things I pointed out, in 2 verses. In Daniel, I think it's Daniel chapter 8 or chapter 12, I don't remember right now. But in 2 verses, there's 3 times where the angel tells Daniel, this is for the time of the end. This is for the time of the end. This is for, in 3 verses. This is when I was telling you about how, even I have fallen into the, this was just Babylon and Persia and Greece. Well, yeah, it's that territory. It is that territory. But guess what? These powers are going to rise up in the end. And what do we see rising up? Okay? We've already seen Iraq rise up and get smacked down. Where was Babylon? Basically in modern-day Iraq. Who else is rising right now?
Turkey, Iran.
Iran. Yeah, Turkey, but Iran is next, remember? You see? It's happening again. It's happening again. And the angel specifically told Daniel it's for the time of the end.
So then Daniel closed it, and then because if people start dwelling on it, it would mess things up.
Yes, exactly. And that's why people did not, think about it. Think about it. People, and not just people, people did not recognize Jesus at his first coming. Why? Because everybody was looking for that conquering Messiah. And not just people. Remember, Satan, the demons, they were all looking for that conquering Messiah. And how do I know? Well, look at when the demons, like when Jesus came to the man who was in the tombs. Remember the man who was filled with demons? He said, what is your name? We are legion because we are many. Do you remember that story? And the man was naked and breaking chains. They couldn't even chain him. Right? What did they say to him? Have you come to destroy us before our time? Have you come to throw us into the abyss before the time? Well, what time are they looking for?
The end.
The end. They knew who he was, but they were like, it's not time yet. It's not time. And that wasn't the only time that was said to him. Remember the boy who would be thrown into the fire, the one that Jesus cast out the demon, and then the disciple, because the disciples could not. Remember that one? Okay? And they said, are you here to send us into the abyss before that time? Okay? Everybody focused on Daniel. Everybody. Even the evil spirits focused on Daniel. See, we got cross communication. Okay? But like I said, now you have Ezekiel. His ministry is specifically to Israel. Daniel and John, their ministry is specifically to the church, to all the saints. Okay? That's why Daniel's is told to seal it up. And then Daniel and Ezekiel, well, theirs was a lot more vague. Remember I said John's was different from their two? John gets a lot more specific before the time of the end. He gets to open it up and start telling us more specifically what we can be looking forward to. Okay? So there's two Old Testament prophets right there that actually help us to explain what's going on in the book of Revelation, including the throne room of God, including the scroll that they all get to see. Ezekiel has to eat it. It says it's sweet to my mouth, but then it made me sick.